Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to present here today. I'm going to present another study along the lines that we've been hearing here in this session, looking at TLS and ALS systems. And the intention here is to quantify biomass and biomass change, but also focused on fuels and fuel consumption in relation to fires. So I have quite a cast of colleagues. This kind of combines efforts from several different projects and several different funding sources, including the Joint Fire Science Program, the CERTA program. This is Strategic Environmental Research and Development Program funded by the Department of Defense. And I neglected to include NASA, actually some NASA Fire Chem Program funding going towards these efforts, as well as the Forest Service, whom I work for. So to outline the approach I'm going to give today, for the purposes of this talk, I'm equating biomass with fuel, and I'm equating biomass change with fuel consumption. So the methods that we're working on here, although we're focused on fuels and fuel consumption, I think they are relevant to other types of disturbance to look at biomass and biomass change. So first, I'll be focusing on some smaller scale experiments in the southeastern U.S. Where we're tying in with prescribed fire operations on Department of Defense installations, where it's practical and logistically feasible to do prescribed fire experiments. And then going back to the northwestern U.S., where I'm from, where it's more of a wildfire scenario, and can we use some of these same ideas for estimating fuels and fuel consumption at a larger scale. So I'll be focusing on TLS datasets for the smaller scale prescribed fire experiments, and then ALS, airborne, for the wildfires. And I should also mention that a lot of the funding and the impetus behind this research is about smoke. We want to do better fuel characterization because it's fuels that burn that generate fire behavior and then generate smoke emissions. And there's a lot of concern about smoke in downwind communities, so currently quite a bit of the funding for looking at these questions that I'm looking at is actually driven by what do we do about the smoke, and can we try to manage our fires to mitigate smoke impacts. So then, I guess the last thing I'll say is by having better fuel consumption models, we want to be able to better constrain the emissions estimates from these fires. So first, going to the southeastern U.S. So I've been working in a couple of DoD installations. DoD, again, is Department of Defense. The work started at Eglin Air Force Base in the Florida Panhandle here. And today I'll be focused more on an Army base called Fort Jackson in South Carolina. But we're also developing these methods down here at Tall Timbers Research Station, where they have a very active burning program. And in all of these places, they do a lot of prescribed burning every year, or every other year. They try to burn almost everywhere on their landscape to maintain an open condition, to promote easier training exercises for military personnel. So that's their operational reason for burning, but it also maintains forest health. The frequent burning maintains healthier forests, and I'm taking advantage of that to do these prescribed fire experiments. So here is one of the fires that we did. This happens to be at Tall Timbers, but the vegetation looks very similar in the other southeastern study sites that I mentioned. These are small-scale fires, so this burn plot we're doing here is about, it's actually less than a hectare in size, about 40 meters by 40 meters. And so there's sort of a fire line that's built around the burn block, and then we light the fire and let it burn through and observe the fire characteristics. And before the fire, we measure the fuels. After the fire, we go back and measure the fuels again, post-fire, and all kinds of measurements going on. Smoke, we're measuring the smoke. You can see a UAV here. So we're not only just using TLS and ALS, we're using UAVs as well. I'm not going to present any UAV results here today, and I know Nicholas will be disappointed by that, but, well, kind of to reinforce the last talk, the UAV methods are kind of lagging behind, and so far we're not seeing a signal through the noise from the UAV data. So I'm not sharing that with you today. Again, why do we need to do this in the first place? We want better informed fire and fuel management for these installations. With better fuels data, acknowledging that fuels are very heterogeneous, we'll have better inputs to fire behavior models, source characterization for emissions, and then maybe someday we'll care more about carbon balance and carbon dynamics in the US. Okay, but again, so for this talk, biomass equals fuel, biomass change equals heat and smoke. Okay, some methods. This will be very brief. This is actually a TLS scan of one of our study plots. So this is now focusing on Fort Jackson up here in South Carolina. This is a map of the Fort Jackson Army base, and these are management units. And so they will burn each one of these units throughout usually the dormant season, sometimes in the growing season. These fires that we did were in the growing season. So we did some experimental burn plots here in this, a couple of management units here, and then a couple other ones up here. And then these are the zoom shots of it. This is the airborne LiDAR canopy height model, and you can get a sense for the size of these burn plots, about 40 by 40 meters. And then the blue dots, these are shrubs that we sampled in the field to then build an empirical model to predict shrub fuel density from the LiDAR. And even though this is airborne, we're going to do that from the TLS scans. So each one of these experimental burn plots, I think there are, is that 6? We've got 4 pairs of shrubs that we destructively sample to train our models. So this is how they were laid out for 2 of these burn plots. One is sort of a lower density plot condition where we put the shrub plots up in this burn block, and then that's this picture on the left, and then on the right is the high density burn plot. We named those plots for kind of the portion of the burn plot where we sampled shrub fuels. So these red dots here are pre and post shrubs that we sampled for destructive sampling. And this is subjective, okay? It's like, okay, you look good and you look good. You're my shrub pair. And we just picked shrubs of similar stature. So we like paired up a couple large shrubs or shrub clumps, a couple small ones, a couple medium ones, and they were all sparkleberry. So we're trying to do something very simple here, just focusing on a single species and a single fuel type, which would be shrubs. Our logic was, well, if we can do this for shrubs from TLS, which seems like the lowest hanging fruit, you know this expression, so it seems like the easiest thing to do, then we'll go forward from there. These other pairs of plots, we call the consumption plots. So again, 4 pairs pre and post fire. So these were systematically laid out in our burn blocks from a random starting point. So that's to capture the other fuel components, because it's not just the shrubs that are burning and that are driving fire behavior and producing smoke. It's the grass, it's the pine needles on the ground, it's the duck underneath the needles, all those components, leaf litter. And importantly, this may seem obvious, but if you're going to destructively sample, you have to do it at different locations. You can't remove all the fuel here to measure the weight and then burn it and expect to learn anything. You have to then choose a different place to sample the post-fire condition. And that actually complicates the analysis because these are very heterogeneous, fuels vary. So when you're sampling at different locations, you're already introducing another source of variation. Oh, and I should have mentioned, this is an example of a pre-fire sparkleberry shrub that we sampled within this ½ by ½ meter area, centered around a metal conduit that we GPS with high resource grade GPS, a Trimble, and then here's a post-fire shrub here. Okay. We not only sampled like the biomass of the shrub within that square, we actually did vertical sampling. So this is actually very tedious. Here's Louise and Christy Hawley. So they're sampling the weight, they're clipping the shrub biomass within this voxel area. And when they finish with that, they're going to move this down another ½ meter and do it again, and then down to the ground. And then later, so we did this 2 years ago, and then last year, we actually did it at 10 centimeter intervals, starting from the top of the shrub down. So it gets very tedious, but what we then have is a shrub weight to then train our models from the LiDAR data, from the TLS. So this is 3D shrub sampling. Okay, then we set fire to it, it burns, then we go back. Here's a TLS scan of one of these. This is a low density sparkleberry plot. This is the shrub layer down here. So these are not forest fires, okay? These are low intensity fires. The trees are not harmed. There's no trees, or sorry, no flames going into the overstory. It's all confined to the understory. So then the post-fire looks like this. And you can see much of the shrub volume is lost by the fire. And then I think this is a caricato here. He's the one running the TLS. These are some targets. Okay, again, so we're sampling 10 centimeter intervals, and then those weights we're using as the response variable to train our models. So the idea was, well, let's do that with the pre-fire plots and produce a model for predicting pre-fire shrub fuel bulk density. Okay, so these are volumetric units, grams per cubic meter. And then we'll go back after the fire, we'll take our post-fire shrub plots, do the same thing with the post-fire LiDAR. So I've overplotted both relationships between the measured shrub bulk density, and then this is TLS occupied voxel density. So with the TLS data, we constructed virtual 10 centimeter by 10 centimeter by 10 centimeter voxels, and is there TLS points within that voxel? If there is, it's a 1, if there isn't, it's a 0. And then we tally those up within each of those 10 centimeter strata in our shrub sample plots, and this is the relationship. So pre-fire is indicated in blue, and the best fit by this blue line. Post-fire model is plotted in red, and the best fit line is plotted in red. So you can see the scatter here. It's quite a noisy model. So immediately I'm like, well, why are we bothering doing pre and post-fire? We'll just do a combined model, and that's indicated by the purple line here. So that's our model that we're going to then predict shrub fuel bulk density from the TLS occupied voxel metric. And then applying it to that occupied voxel metric produced across the whole extent of the TLS scan across the burn blocks. So why are they so similar? Well, actually, when you burn something, it doesn't burn everything. And actually, you see a lot of variation in fire effects. For example, this shrub here that was just scorched. There wasn't much consumption. And you see this frequently. So this condition here will, there's a lot of reflectivity here on this shrub, even post-fire, compared to the pre-fire condition. So it's blurry. It's not a dramatic difference by the fire. So we did this for our 6 burn blocks. So on the left are the sort of the traditional method using 2D destructive clip plots, sampling. And we have a pre and a post-fire load, and then a calculated consumption. And then this new 3D method over here with the voxel, occupied voxel metric. And I wanted to point out just the variation here. So we've got actually some negative consumption estimates. So the traditional method is falling short because we're basically undersampling. We're not capturing the conditions, and this relates to the problem of having pre and post-fire sample plots that are not at the same locations, all right? We don't have co-located samples. So you have to overcome that variability. So then the mean was actually negative consumption for shrubs. So this is completely inadequate. It's an undersampling problem. However, with the 3D TLS point cloud, we actually have a much more stable consumption estimates based on more stable pre and post-fire maps of shrub fuel density. And based on past work looking at shrub consumption, we have good confidence that this is about right. And there actually isn't that much variability between these 6 plots. They're replicate plots. So we expect to find similar pre and post-fire fuels and consumption, unlike what we found with traditional measures. And then, I want to just remind you that this is just looking at the shrubs. We didn't try to, with the TLS, we didn't try to characterize the herbaceous, the leaf litter, needle cast stuff. And so this column graph here for each of the 6 burn plots shows these different fuel components. So the shrubs are in blue, and where it's hashed is a post-fire estimate. So this is based on those systematic paired sample plots. The shrubs are just a tiny component. In fact, the shrubs only account for 1.8% of fuel consumption, as estimated by those consumption plots. So even if we can do a good job of estimating shrub consumption, we are nowhere near getting an estimate for total fuel consumption. Okay, how much time do I have? A minute. Ooh. Okay, well, I don't have a lot of results here to show anyway for the wildfire scenario in the West, but the idea here is to select wildfires that are burning through areas where we have existing LiDAR. And then we just have to invest in the post-fire LiDAR to do our pre and post-fire fuel estimates and then difference in unit consumption. So this busy graph here is for 2 fires, the Poultry Fire in Oregon and the Los Conchas Fire in New Mexico. We built pre-fire models and then post-fire models for each of these fires, and then on the right column of each is a pool model. The short story is that by pooling both the pre and post-fire plots, we develop a much more stable model, better fit statistics. So it makes sense to combine the data, much like we did in the prescribed fire experiments, combining pre and post-fire plot measures. You're also doubling your plot count. So it gives you a better model. We apply the model pre and post-fire. Here's the poultry fire here and the Los Conchas fire down here. And the difference between them is consumption. So that's what we're showing here. Change in tree biomass. And then so these are the tree biomass. These are crown fires. These are wildfires. And this is change in surface biomass. So we use 2 separate models for those 2 kind of big fuel components. And we're getting a signal because you can see the change reflects the burn perimeter. Down here, actually, the post-fire LiDAR is only within the fire perimeter, so you can't really appreciate that. And now we're moving on to some more recent fires. These are the TB and Keithley fires in these locations in the northwestern U.S. This is the fire perimeter, and then we flew post-fire LiDAR, as shown by the black boxes. Our plots are indicated by the X's. So we're doing this retrospectively. We don't have the luxury of pre-fire data at all. So we're doing burn and unburned plots inside and outside of these perimeters. Again, pooling the data. And we're learning, again, that pooling the data gives us more reliable models for predicting pre or post-fire fuels. That's an aerial shot of the Keithley fire. This was in a range condition. Very, very few trees, hardly any fuel to burn. A lot of cheap grass, actually. Here's a teepee fire where there's some trees and a sagebrush understory with grass. This is sampling on teepee fire, how it looks on the ground. Very little consumption because there isn't much fuel. And sometimes you get a little bit more sage and an occasional tree. Teepee fire, more open canopy condition, so there is a significant tree component. This is a land fire map of fuel types. These are notoriously noisy and not very accurate, but it is predominantly forested on the western portion and then non-forested on the eastern side. So this is sort of sage grass fuel type, and this is ponderous pine with the sage grass understory. So we stratified on those fuel types, sampled burned and unburned fuels, and then built these models. This is kind of a quick and dirty analysis to try to get the consumption estimate at the scale of the whole burn. And then here's our initial fuel consumption maps. The tree component here, again, the trees are in the western portion. We're not getting much of a signal here because a lot of the burn was under the canopy. Most of the consumption was in the surface fuels, as shown here. We're getting the signal, but we're also getting noise because we think we're seeing consumption. The model's telling us consumption out here, but it wasn't. So that's error. But we are getting a signal, so we need to figure out how to remove this error from our estimate. And with the Keithley fire, that range fire, it's hard to appreciate here because the trees are sort of, few trees are scaling the display here, so you can't really see surface or total consumption that much. But anyway, the signal's weak, there's very little consumption, and LiDAR's not that very good at these kind of sparsely vegetated landscapes. Okay, I think I'm out of time, so I'm going to leave there, and thanks for your attention.